The gunshot still echoed in Rylan Isaacs' ears 3 years after the ambush that had left him alone in the world. As the dust swirled across the main street of St. George, Utah Territory, he pulled his hat lower over his weathered face and pushed through the batwing doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon, determined to drown the memories that haunted him on this particular day, the anniversary of Elizabeth's death. The year was 1876, and the promise of silver in the nearby mountains had transformed St. George from a quiet Mormon settlement into a bustling frontier town. Rylan had no interest in mining. He worked as a ranch foreman at the Triple J, keeping to himself and avoiding entanglements of any kind, especially those of the heart. The usual Rylan. Asked Sam, the bartender, already reaching for the bottle of whiskey kept specially for his most reliable customer. "Double today," Rylan responded, his voice rough from disuse. He rarely spoke more than necessary these days. Words were like currency to him, he spent them sparingly. Sam placed the drink before him and lingered, wiping the same spot on the counter repeatedly. "Heard Jacobson's bringing in some new horses tomorrow. Might need an extra hand breaking them." Rylan nodded, grateful for the information but unwilling to engage further. His calloused fingers circled the glass as he stared into the amber liquid, seeing not whiskey, but Elizabeth's eyes, the same warm color that had once looked at him with so much love. The saloon doors swung open, bringing with them a gust of autumn wind and the town's postmaster, Gerald Tucker. "Mail came in, Rylan," Gerald announced, approaching the bar. "Got something from back east for you." Rylan frowned. No one from back east would be writing to him. Everyone who had ever cared about him was either dead or had forgotten him long ago. Taking the envelope, he recognized the handwriting immediately. Sarah, Elizabeth's sister. His hands trembled slightly as he tore it open, scanning the neat script with growing disbelief. "Bad news?" Sam asked, noting Rylan's expression. "Sarah's coming west," Rylan muttered. "Says she's bringing someone with her." 3 days later, Rylan stood at the stagecoach station, his hat in his hands, watching as the dust cloud on the horizon grew larger. He had considered not showing up, but some sense of obligation to Elizabeth's memory had dragged him from his solitary cabin. The coach rattled into town, horses lathered from the final push. As the door swung open, Sarah emerged, her familiar face lined with weariness from the journey. Behind her came a young woman with copper-colored hair and a simple blue traveling dress. "Rylan," Sarah said, embracing him briefly. "This is Olivia Osborne, Elizabeth's cousin." Rylan nodded stiffly at the newcomer, noticing how her green eyes, nothing like Elizabeth's, assessed him carefully. "Mr. Isaacs," Olivia said, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent. "I've heard much about you." "Can't imagine much of it good," he replied, immediately regretting his rudeness. Sarah intervened smoothly. "We're both exhausted. Is there somewhere we can stay?" "Widow Henderson runs a boarding house," Rylan explained, gesturing down the street. "Clean beds, decent food, I'll take you there." As they walked, Rylan carried their bags, keeping his eyes forward and his responses to Sarah's questions brief. He was acutely aware of Olivia's presence beside them, her gait slightly uneven. "How long do you plan to stay?" he asked as they reached the boarding house. Sarah exchanged a glance with Olivia. "That's what we need to discuss with you, in private when we're settled." That evening, after ensuring the women were comfortable at the boarding house, Rylan found himself seated in the small parlor as Sarah explained her reason for coming. "Elizabeth's Aunt Olivia's mother passed last month," Sarah said quietly. "Her final wish was for Olivia to have a fresh start away from Boston society that's been unkind." Olivia sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, eyes downcast. "What's that got to do with me?" Rylan asked, already knowing he wouldn't like the answer. "I'm continuing west to California," Sarah explained, "but Olivia needs somewhere safe to stay for a while, somewhere she can heal." Rylan stood abruptly. "No, I work sunrise to sunset." "I've got no time to look after." "I don't need looking after," Olivia interrupted, speaking for the first time since they'd sat down. "I need employment and a roof. I can cook, clean, and keep accounts." Rylan noticed then the walking stick leaning against her chair, the way she held her left leg carefully, some old injury perhaps. "The Triple J has no place for a woman like you," he said firmly. "You'd be better off in town." "A woman like me?" Olivia's voice sharpened. "You mean a cripple?" Sarah placed a hand on her cousin's arm. Olivia. No, Olivia continued, fixing Rylan with a challenging stare. I want Mr. Isaacs to understand that I'm not seeking charity. I'm offering a fair exchange of services for lodging. Rylan felt something stir within him, the first flicker of respect. I live alone in a one-room cabin. It wouldn't be proper. The main house at the Triple J has rooms, Sarah pointed out. You told me yourself the owner is rarely there. Trapped by his own words and the memory of his promise to Elizabeth that he would always help her family if needed, Rylan finally nodded. 2 weeks. I'll speak to Mr. Jacobson about giving you a trial as housekeeper for the main house. After that, you're on your own. The relief on Sarah's face was palpable. Thank you, Rylan. As he left the boarding house, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a terrible mistake. The next morning, Rylan brought the wagon to collect Olivia and her modest trunk. Sarah had already departed on the early stage to Sacramento, leaving Olivia standing alone on the boardwalk, her walking stick in one hand and a determined expression on her face. Can you climb up? He asked, not unkindly. I can manage, she replied, though it took her several attempts to hoist herself onto the high seat. They rode in silence for the first mile, the only sounds the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional snort of the horses. Finally, Olivia spoke. I won't be a burden to you, Mr. Isaacs. Rylan kept his eyes on the trail. Never said you would be. Not in words, perhaps. She adjusted her position, wincing slightly, but you've made your reluctance clear. I understand you had a life with Elizabeth that ended too soon and now her family has imposed on you. The direct mention of Elizabeth's name hit him like a physical blow. You don't know anything about it. I know she loved you completely, Olivia said softly. Her letters to my mother were full of your adventures together, how you built your home log by log, how you danced with her under the stars even though there was no music. Rylan's hands tightened on the reins. That life is gone. Yes, Olivia agreed, surprising him. And I'm not here to resurrect it or replace her. I'm here to build something new for myself. For the first time, Rylan looked directly at her, seeing not just Elizabeth's cousin, but a woman with her own story, one that had clearly included pain. What happened to your leg? He asked bluntly. Childhood fever, she answered without hesitation. It withered the muscles. The doctors said I was lucky to walk at all. The ranch appeared on the horizon, a sprawling collection of buildings centered around the 2-story main house. Several cowboys paused in their work to watch as Rylan drove the wagon toward the house. Mr. Jacobson agreed to give you a try, Rylan explained as they approached. The house has been without proper care since his wife passed last year. He's mostly in Denver handling business, so you'll have the place to yourself most times. And you? Olivia asked. Where will you be? I've got my cabin near the south pasture, he replied. You won't see much of me except at meal times when I'm checking on things here. True to his word, Rylan kept his distance over the next few days, though he found himself watching from afar as Olivia established herself at the main house. Despite her disability, she moved with purpose, transforming the neglected home with an efficiency that impressed even Mr. Jacobson when he made a brief appearance. That Eastern gal's got grit, the ranch owner commented to Rylan as they discussed the upcoming cattle drive. Doesn't complain, does the work of 2 people. Might be worth keeping around. Rylan merely nodded, unwilling to admit he'd been thinking the same thing. A week into Olivia's stay, a fierce storm blew in from the mountains. Rylan rode through the downpour to check on the house, concerned about leaks in the aging roof. He found Olivia in the kitchen, calmly placing buckets under several drips while a stew bubbled on the stove. You should have called for help, he said, removing his dripping hat. For a few leaks. She smiled slightly. I've managed worse. Lightning flashed, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The lights flickered and Olivia instinctively reached out, grabbing Rylan's hand in the momentary darkness. The touch, the first he'd experienced in years that wasn't a handshake or accidental brush, sent a jolt through him. When the lantern light steadied, they both looked down at their joined hands. Olivia quickly released him. I'm sorry, I've always been frightened of storms. Rylan flexed his fingers, still feeling the ghost of her touch. No harm done, but harm had been done. A crack had appeared in the wall he'd built around himself, and as he ate the stew Olivia served him, Seated across the table while the storm raged outside, Rylan found himself noticing things he'd been deliberately blind to: the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when concentrating, how her eyes crinkled slightly when she smiled, the quiet competence in everything she did. The 2-week deadline came and went without discussion. Olivia had made herself indispensable to the functioning of the ranch house, and even Rylan couldn't deny that the hot meals and clean living space had improved everyone's morale. October turned to November, bringing the first dusting of snow to the Utah hills. Rylan returned from a 3-day ride checking the northern boundaries to find Olivia teaching Pedro, the ranch's Mexican cook, how to make apple pie. "There you are," she said, looking up with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased to see him. "We were beginning to worry." The week caught him off guard, the casual implication that they were connected somehow, that his absence mattered. "Storm slowed me down," he explained, hanging his coat by the door. "Thought I might get back before it hit." "You're soaked through," Olivia observed. "I've heated water for a bath in the washroom. Pedro, watch that crust while I show Mr. Isaacs where everything is." Before he could protest, she was leading him down the hallway, limping slightly but moving with determination. "You don't need to fuss," he muttered, uncomfortable with being cared for. Olivia paused, turning to face him. "Is accepting help so difficult for you, Mr. Isaacs?" "Rylan," he corrected automatically. "And yes, it is." Something softened in her expression. "I understand independence, believe me, but there's no weakness in letting someone else shoulder the load occasionally." In the washroom, she efficiently laid out towels and soap, then hesitated at the door. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you. The town is having a harvest festival next weekend. Would you consider accompanying me? It would be good to meet more people." The request was reasonable, innocent even, but Rylan felt panic rising in his chest. Public gatherings, socializing, standing beside Olivia while townspeople inevitably speculated it was too much. "I don't do festivals," he said flatly. Disappointment flickered across her face before she masked it with a polite nod. "Of course. Enjoy your bath." As the door closed behind her, Rylan sank onto the edge of the tub, wondering why refusing her simple request felt like he'd just kicked a puppy. The day of the harvest festival dawned clear and cold. Rylan busied himself with repairs to the corral, deliberately staying far from the main house as Olivia prepared to attend with Pedro's wife, Maria, who had befriended the Eastern woman. He was hammering with unnecessary force when Chuck, one of the younger cowboys, approached. "Boss wants you to go fetch Miss Olivia from town before dark," he said, smirking slightly. "Says it ain't proper for her to be coming back with just Maria after sundown." Rylan scowled. "Can't you go?" "Got night watch," Chuck replied, still grinning. "Besides, everyone knows you're sweet on her." "I'm not sweet on anyone," Rylan growled, driving another nail with enough force to split the wood. "And if you value your job, you'll keep such nonsense to yourself." But as afternoon faded toward evening, Rylan found himself riding toward town, his stomach knotted with a tension he refused to examine. The main street of St. George was festooned with lanterns and harvest decorations, the town square bustling with activity. He spotted Olivia immediately, her copper hair gleaming in the lantern light as she laughed at something Maria said. She wore a dark green dress he hadn't seen before, and someone had placed flowers in her hair. For a moment, Rylan simply watched her, struck by how vibrant she appeared surrounded by people, so different from the quiet efficiency she displayed at the ranch. She belonged here among civilization, not isolated with a man who could barely string 2 sentences together on a good day. As if sensing his presence, Olivia looked up, her smile faltering slightly when she saw him. She excused herself from Maria and made her way toward him, navigating through the crowd with her walking stick. "Mr. Isaacs, Rylan," she corrected herself. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Jacobson sent me to escort you back," he explained, feeling awkward and out of place among the festivities. "It's getting dark." "Oh," something like disappointment crossed her features. "Of course, just let me say goodbye to everyone." As she turned away, a familiar voice called out, "Well, if it isn't the lone wolf of Triple J, never thought I'd see you at a social gathering, Isaacs." Sheriff Tom Parker approached, his badge glinting in the lamplight. He'd been one of the first to reach Rylan after the ambush that killed Elizabeth, had helped bury her properly while Rylan was still half mad with grief. "Just here on ranch business, Tom," Rylan replied, shaking the lawman's hand. "Business, is it?" Tom's eyes drifted to Olivia as she made her farewells. "That's what you're calling it these days. It's not like that," Rylan said firmly. "She's Elizabeth's cousin. I'm helping out the family, that's all." Tom studied him for a long moment. "You know, it's been 3 years, Rylan." "Elizabeth wouldn't want—" "Don't," Rylan interrupted harshly. "Don't tell me what she would want." The sheriff raised his hands in surrender. "All right, but that girl looks at you the way my Jenny used to look at me before I got my head out of my ass and proposed. Just something to think about." Before Rylan could respond, Olivia returned, smiling politely at the sheriff as introductions were made. "I've heard much about you, Miss Osborne," Tom said, tipping his hat. "Folks say you've breathed new life into the Triple J." "People exaggerate," she replied modestly. "I simply keep things tidy. And feed half the ranch hands who'd been surviving on Pedro's beans," Tom added with a chuckle. "Well, I won't keep you. Night's drawing in." The ride back to the ranch began in silence, the lantern hanging from the wagon casting just enough light on the trail. Olivia sat beside Rylan, close enough that he could smell the faint floral scent in her hair. "Did you enjoy yourself?" he finally asked, needing to break the tension. "Yes," she answered. "Everyone was very kind, Mrs. Wilson asked me to join her sewing circle, and Reverend Adams invited me to help with the church Christmas preparations." "Sounds like you're finding your place here," Rylan observed, surprised by the twist of emotion the thought provoked. Olivia was quiet for a moment before asking, "Would that bother you if I stayed in St. George permanently?" The question caught him off guard. "Why would it? That was the plan all along, wasn't it, for you to establish yourself?" "Yes, but," she hesitated, "I've grown fond of the Triple J. And its people." The implication hung in the air between them, but Rylan couldn't bring himself to acknowledge it. Instead, he pointed out, "Winter's coming. You might change your mind when the snow piles up and you're stuck with the same faces for months." "I grew up in Boston," she reminded him. "I know about winter isolation. It's the company that matters, not the weather." They fell silent again as the wagon crested the final hill, the ranch buildings visible in the moonlight. As they pulled up to the main house, Rylan helped Olivia down, careful to support her without making her disability an issue. At the door, she paused. "Thank you for coming to get me. I know crowds aren't to your liking." "Just doing as asked," he replied, turning to leave. "Rylan," she called softly, would you hold my hand just once? Not because I'm frightened or need help, just because I'd like to know what it feels like when it's offered freely." The simple request stopped him cold. He turned back, seeing vulnerability in her eyes that she usually kept hidden behind competence and determination. "Why?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. "Because in 3 months you've never once touched me intentionally," she answered. "And sometimes a person just needs to be touched to remember they're alive." The words hit him with unexpected force, piercing straight through his carefully maintained armor. Without analyzing his actions, Rylan stepped forward and extended his hand, palm up. Olivia placed her smaller hand in his, her fingers cool against his calloused skin. It was a simple touch, nothing more than palm against palm, yet Rylan felt something shift inside him, a door long sealed beginning to crack open. "Good night, Rylan," she whispered, squeezing once before releasing him and disappearing inside. He stood frozen on the porch, staring at his empty hand as if it belonged to someone else. The moment replayed in his mind not just the touch, but her words. Sometimes a person just needs to be touched to remember they're alive. With a sudden clarity, Rylan realized he'd been more dead than alive since Elizabeth's passing. He'd been existing, not living, going through motions without feeling, speaking without connecting, seeing without appreciating. The revelation followed him back to his cabin, keeping him awake long into the night as snow began to fall outside his window. The first major snowstorm of the season hit a week later, blanketing the ranch in 3 feet of snow overnight. Rylan fought his way through the drifts to check on the main house, finding Olivia calmly keeping the fires stoked while preparing food for the hands trapped in the bunkhouse. "I was worried about you in that cabin," she admitted as he stomped snow from his boots. "The wind was fierce last night." Takes more than wind to bother me, he said, though he was touched by her concern. Need help getting this food to the bunkhouse. They worked together packing baskets, and Rylan found himself watching her hands capable, quick, the same hands that had sought his in a simple request for human connection. What? Olivia asked, catching his gaze. Nothing, he replied automatically, then reconsidered. Actually, I was wondering if you'd join me for dinner tonight. At my cabin, I'm a passable cook when I try. The surprise on her face was quickly replaced by a warm smile. I'd like that very much. That evening, Rylan prepared a simple meal of venison stew and biscuits, clearing away the usual clutter of his bachelor existence. When Olivia arrived, bundled against the cold, he was struck by how right she looked in his space, as if a missing piece had finally been placed. It's lovely, she said, looking around the cabin he'd built with his own hands. Very you. Not sure that's a compliment, he replied with a hint of humor. Olivia laughed. It is. It's honest and sturdy without pretension. Over dinner, their conversation flowed more easily than ever before. Rylan found himself sharing stories he hadn't told in years about his childhood in Pennsylvania, his journey west, even some of the lighter moments of his life with Elizabeth. She sounds wonderful, Olivia said softly when he described Elizabeth's determination to grow roses in the harsh Utah climate. She was, Rylan agreed, surprised to find the memory brought warmth rather than pain. Stubborn as a mule when she set her mind to something, like someone else I know. Olivia's eyes widened slightly at the comparison. I'll take that as another compliment. After dinner, they sat by the fire, the howling wind outside making the cabin seem even cozier. Rylan found himself speaking of things he'd never intended to share. I made a vow after she died, he admitted. That I'd never put myself in that position again to love someone and lose them. The pain was too much. Olivia watched the firelight play across his features. And now I'm not so sure that was the right promise to make, he said slowly. Elizabeth lived fully, loved deeply. She'd be ashamed of how I've been existing these past years. We all cope with loss differently, Olivia offered. There's no shame in protecting yourself. Maybe not, Rylan conceded, but there comes a point where protection becomes prison. As the evening grew late, the storm intensified. Rylan peered out the window at the blinding snow. You can't go back tonight, it's too dangerous. I thought you might say that. Olivia nodded toward the small bag she'd brought. I came prepared to stay. The implications of her spending the night in his one-room cabin hung between them. Rylan cleared his throat. You take the bed, I'll sleep by the fire. Don't be ridiculous, she countered. It's freezing and that bed is big enough for two with room to spare. I trust you, Rylan. Her trust humbled him. They prepared for sleep awkwardly but without incident, each staying carefully to their side of the mattress. Yet as the night deepened and the cabin cooled, Rylan awoke to find Olivia had moved closer in her sleep, seeking warmth. In the dim light of the banked fire, he studied her face relaxed in sleep, a strand of copper hair falling across her cheek. Without thinking, he gently brushed it away, his fingers lingering on her skin. Olivia's eyes fluttered open at his touch. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the barriers between them thinner than they had ever been. I'm afraid, Rylan confessed in a whisper. Of what? She asked, her voice equally soft. Of feeling again. Of caring and then losing. Of opening a door I've kept locked for so long. Olivia reached up, placing her palm against his cheek. I'm afraid, too. Of not being enough, of being seen as broken, of offering my heart only to have it returned unwanted. You're not broken, he said fiercely. You're the strongest person I know. Her smile was tremulous in the firelight. Then perhaps we can be afraid together and find that it's not so terrifying after all. Slowly, giving him every chance to pull away, Olivia leaned forward and pressed her lips to his gentle question of a kiss. Rylan hesitated only a moment before answering, his hand coming up to cradle the back of her head as he deepened the kiss. When they parted, breathless, Rylan saw tears shining in Olivia's eyes. What's wrong? He asked, suddenly uncertain. Nothing, she assured him, smiling through the tears. It's just, I never thought I would find this, someone who sees me, all of me, not just my limitations. I see you, he confirmed, his voice rough with emotion, and I'm beginning to think you might be the bravest thing that's ever happened to me. They talked through the night, sharing fears and hopes, the snow continuing to fall outside as something new and fragile bloomed within the cabin's walls. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a transformed landscape of pristine white. Rylan and Olivia stood on his porch, her hand clasped firmly in his as they surveyed the dazzling scene. "What happens now?" she asked, squinting against the sunlight reflecting off the snow. Rylan considered the question carefully. "Now we take it one day at a time. No promises beyond what we can honestly give." "And what can you honestly give, Rylan Isaacs?" Olivia turned to face him, her expression serious. "Today," he answered. "Tomorrow, if we're lucky, a willingness to try even when it scares me, and my hand whenever you want to hold it." Olivia's smile bloomed slowly, like the sun breaking through clouds. "That seems like a good place to start." Spring came early that year, the snow melting to reveal new growth across the ranch. Rylan stood on the porch of the main house, their house now, since Jacobson had agreed to sell it to them after their wedding the previous month. Olivia was in the garden, determined to coax flowers from the stubborn Utah soil. She looked up as he approached, shielding her eyes against the sun. "The new foals are doing well," he reported, crouching beside her to examine her work. "Strong legs on all of them." "Unlike their mistress," she quipped, gesturing to her walking stick propped against a nearby tree. Rylan shook his head. "I told you there's nothing wrong with your legs that concerns me. They've carried you this far, haven't they?" Olivia laughed, the sound still new enough to make his heart skip. "They have indeed, far enough to find you, which makes them perfectly adequate." He helped her to her feet, pulling her close for a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened. Even after 6 months together, the wonder of being able to touch her freely had not diminished. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked as they walked hand in hand toward the house. "Opening that door you kept locked for so long." Rylan considered the question, thinking of Elizabeth, a cherished memory now, but no longer a ghost that haunted his every moment. He thought of the nights with Olivia in his arms, of mornings waking to her smile, of the future stretching before them filled with possibilities rather than emptiness. "Not for a single moment," he answered truthfully. "You asked me to hold your hand just once, but I intend to keep holding it for as long as you'll let me." "That might be a very long time," Olivia warned, leaning into his side as they climbed the porch steps. "I'm counting on it," Rylan replied, squeezing her hand in his, the simplest gesture that had somehow saved them both. That night, as they sat on the porch watching stars appear in the vast Utah sky, Olivia rested her head on Rylan's shoulder. "Do you think there's a word for what happened to us? Finding love when neither of us was looking for it." Rylan thought for a moment before answering. "Redemption, maybe, or just plain luck." "I like that," she murmured, "just plain luck." As the moon rose over the ranch they now shared, Rylan reflected on the journey that had brought them together, how a simple request to hold hands had cracked open a heart he'd sworn would remain forever closed. Some might call it fate or destiny, but perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps it was just two broken people finding in each other exactly what they needed to become whole again. And that, Rylan decided as he pressed a kiss to Olivia's hair, was worth all the risk in the world.